"There's no place left that will take me," she said from the rancher's cold steps. The door latch was froze up again. I remember that because I had to hit it 3 times with the heel of my hand before it gave, and my hand was already cold, and I remember thinking I needed to get out to the barn before the water trough skinned over. That was the kind of morning it was. Temperature had dropped overnight without asking permission from anybody. Ground was iron. The sky had that white look it gets before it means business, not gray like a storm coming but white, flat, like it had turned its back on you. I pulled on my coat, the brown canvas one with the frayed right cuff I never got around to fixing, and I walked out onto the steps and stopped. She was sitting on the bottom step. Not standing on it, waiting to knock. Sitting on it on the cold wood, her back against the post and her knees pulled up in a carpetbag that had seen a whole lot better days, sitting beside her like it was the only thing in the world still keeping her company. She had a coat on, but it wasn't much of a coat. Dark wool, the kind women wear to church, not to sleep outside in November. She was looking out at the yard, not at me, like she hadn't heard the door. Or maybe she had, and she just didn't care anymore which way it went. I stood there a second. I said, "Morning." She turned and looked up at me. She wasn't young. She wasn't old either. Somewhere in her 40s, I figured, though she had the look of a woman who'd been tired for a while and the tiredness had aged her some. Dark eyes, steady, red at the rims but not from crying, from cold and from not sleeping. She had a way of looking at you that didn't flinch from it and didn't ask anything extra either, just looked. She said, "I wasn't sure anybody'd be up yet." "I'm always up," I said. She nodded at that like it made sense, like she'd factored that in already. I said, "How long you been out here?" She looked back at the yard. "Since the dark started going thin," she said. That was a couple hours at least. The sky that morning didn't start going thin till somewhere around 5. I said, "You better come in." She didn't say thank you. She just stood up, picked up that carpetbag, and came up the steps past me into the kitchen. She didn't come in like a woman who'd been rescued. She came in like a woman who'd been waiting to be let in out of the cold, which is a different thing entirely. My name is Harlan Cade. I've run the Cade spread, which is what everyone in Garnett County calls it, even though there hasn't been more than one Cade on it in going on 11 years, up in the flats north of the Cedar Ridge Road. 160 acres of hard grass range, a decent water source, a house that leans just enough to the southwest that you have to shim the kitchen table to keep a glass from sliding. I've run cattle on it, sheep for a while when cattle prices dropped, and for the last 3 years mostly horses, which I'm better at than people usually expect from a man my age. I was 61 that November. I don't say it to establish something. I say it because it matters to how a man thinks about things, to what he takes as his reasonable due in the world. When you're 61 and you've been alone for 11 years, you stop expecting the unexpected. Things surprise you a little more slowly. You've learned to let them settle before you decide what they are. She stood in my kitchen and I put on water for coffee, and she set the carpetbag down beside the door, not all the way in the room, just inside it. Like she hadn't decided yet whether she was staying or not. Like she was leaving herself the option. I said, "You eat." She said, "Yesterday." I didn't make a thing of it. I put bacon in the pan and it started to pop, and she sat down at the table, the bag still by the door. I got the coffee going. I didn't ask her anything while she ate. She wasn't the kind that talked in paragraphs, and I could see that right off. There are people you can read in the first 5 minutes if you pay attention, and she was one of them, not a woman who'd been waiting for someone to ask her to unburden herself. The opposite of that. Someone who'd learned to keep the weight arranged so it didn't show unless she wanted it to. She ate everything on the plate, and she drank 2 cups of coffee. Then she set the cup down and she said, "I'll be straight with you." I said, "All right." She said, "There's no place left that will take me." She said it plain. Not like it was something she was ashamed of, exactly, but like it was something she'd already sat with long enough that the shame had gone flat. Like she'd worn it smooth by carrying it, and now it was just a fact. I waited. She said her name was Nora Vass. She'd come up from the south, from below the Platte, where she'd had a position cooking and keeping house for a man named Giddens on a cattle operation twice the size of mine. She'd held that position for 6 years. Giddens had died in September, and the son had come out from Cincinnati and closed down the operation and let everybody go, and Nora had come north looking for work. She tried 4 places in Garnett County in the last 2 weeks. The first 2 said they had no need of a cook. The third said they'd need her to share the bunkhouse with the hands, which she had declined. The fourth was the Bleecker Spread, which is the largest outfit in this part of the county, and she'd made it all the way to talking to Albert Bleecker himself, who was 68 years old and had buried 2 wives and was, by his own admission, looking for a third. And when Nora had made clear that a position was all she was looking for and not a marriage, Bleecker had wished her luck in such a way that the good luck seemed unlikely to follow. She'd slept 2 nights in the livery in Garnett, which Dunk Perry, who runs the livery, would allow because he's a decent enough man, if not a particularly brave one. On the 3rd morning, Dunk told her word had gotten around and he couldn't keep her on without it making trouble. She'd asked around town, and someone had told her about the Cade Spread. Alone up there, that person had said, "Old rancher on his own, might need someone." She told me all of this straight, looking at the table. When she finished, she looked up. She said, "I'm a good cook. I can keep a house. I know enough about stock to be useful. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work." I looked at her. I said, "The winter pay is thin. I can do bed and board and $12 a month until spring when I can do better." She said, "That'll do." I said, "The room off the kitchen is small." She said, "I've slept on a livery floor." I said, "I eat early." She said, "I wake up early." We sat there a minute, both of us understanding that something had been settled without either of us making much of it. I got up and showed her the room. In that first week, I watched her the way a man watches anything new on his land, not unfriendly, just careful, alert to what things are before you decide what to do with them. She was up before me. I want to make that clear because in 11 years alone I had not been up after anybody. But she was up before me, every morning, fire going, coffee on, and whatever I was going to have for breakfast already decided on and partly along the way. I came into the kitchen that first morning expecting the usual silence and got instead the smell of wood smoke and biscuits. I stood in the doorway and looked at her standing at that stove, and she said, without turning around, "Coffee's on the table." It was. She kept the house with an efficiency that wasn't fussiness. She didn't rearrange things for the sake of rearranging. She just cleaned what needed cleaning and fixed what needed fixing. On the 3rd day, I came in from the barn and found she'd rehung the back door, so it swung clean and closed square without me having to lift it and set it. I hadn't asked her to do that. I'd been lifting and setting that door for probably 4 years. I stood there and swung it twice, and it was a good feeling, the kind you don't quite know how to describe, not gratitude exactly, but something close to it, only quieter. She didn't talk much and neither did I, which suited us both. But when we talked, at meals mostly, she talked straight. She had opinions about things that she stated when she had them and didn't push when she didn't. She'd grown up in Kansas. She'd been married once, to a man named Vass who died of a fever 12 years back and left her a boarding house debt and the clothes on her back, by her account. She'd learned to cook in a cattle camp kitchen when she was 22, and she'd been working in one kind of kitchen or another ever since. She said she liked horses. She said she didn't like cards. She said she thought people who didn't keep their tools put up right were showing you something about how they did everything else. I found out later she was 44. She looked it and didn't look it. She was lean in the way working women get lean, not from starving but from using themselves up. She had hands like a working woman's hands, which is to say they were capable and had some stories in the skin. She didn't primp. She didn't apologize for things that didn't need apologizing for. She moved through a room like a woman who'd made her peace with what rooms were for. On the 5th day, she asked me if I'd mind if she had a look at the horses. I said I didn't mind. She went out to the barn with me and she walked the line of them slowly, looking at each one, not touching, just looking. I had 7 horses at that point. 4 I was breaking for the Carver brothers over in Millhaven, one of my own I'd had for years, and 2 3-year-old mares I was working for resale in the spring. She stopped at the 2nd mare for a while. She said, "How long has she been favoring that left foreleg?" I said, "You saw that." She said, "She's carrying herself just off from how she'd like to." I went in and checked the leg myself. The mare had a small heat in the fetlock, nothing bad, but I'd missed it. I'd been checking her feet when I should have been watching her stand. I felt the heat, and I felt under that a particular kind of quiet satisfaction that is not comfortable if you think about it too hard. The satisfaction of finding a problem before it gets worse, even if the finding was someone else's doing. I said, "Good eye." She said, "I've had some practice." She didn't make it a bigger thing than it was. She just went back to looking at the other horses. The first hard snow came at the end of November. Garnet County gets real winters, not polite winters, not the kind that make for pretty pictures, but the kind that kill stock and freeze pipes and remind a man of every choice he made about where to live and whether he still stands behind them. The snow that hit us at the end of November was 2 feet in 2 days with a wind that pushed it where it didn't belong. I spent the better part of 3 days doing what a man does in that situation, which is move between his animals and his firewood and his food supply and his animals again. You sleep when you can and you eat when you can, and you make your peace with cold. Nora didn't stay inside. I want to say that because I expected her to. Not because she seemed weak, she didn't, but because she wasn't my hand, she was my housekeeper, and I didn't need her to be out in it. But she put on every layer she had and she came out with me, and what I found was that she was useful. Not in a half-useful way, not in a way where you have to manage the help on top of the work. Just useful directly. She knew enough to stay out of the way when staying out of the way was right, and to do the thing that needed doing when she could see it needed doing. On the 2nd day of the storm, one of the Carver mares got loose from her stall. The latch gave. Old hardware, my fault for not replacing it. And she got into the yard in the full blow and started to go sideways. A panicked horse in a snowstorm is a particular kind of problem. They can run themselves into a fence, or through one, or off a drop. This mare was young and she didn't know any better and she was terrified, and she went sideways in the yard at a bad angle, and I was coming around the corner of the barn when I saw Nora already out there. She didn't chase the horse. She stood still in the blowing snow with her arms down and her head slightly turned, and she waited. That's the thing with a panicked horse, you can't chase them back to sense, you have to let them find their way to it. And Nora knew that. She stood there in the storm like she was the still point of it, and the mare circled twice, and on the 2nd circle she slowed, and on the 3rd she stopped maybe 10 feet from Nora, and Nora just stood, and then very slowly the mare came in. I watched Nora put her hand up, flat, palm up, and the mare dropped her nose into it. I walked out through the snow and took the mare's halter, and we walked her back to the barn together, and I rehung the latch with a piece of wire that would do until I could fix it properly, and we stood in the barn out of the wind for a minute, both of us breathing hard. I said, "Where'd you learn that?" She said, "My father had horses. He used to say, a scared thing needs to know there's somewhere still to come to." I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say to that. We went back inside and she made coffee, and we sat at the table and listened to the wind. I have to tell you something about what it is to live alone for a long time, because it matters to what I'm telling you. When you live alone for long enough, you stop noticing certain things. Not because they go away, but because you adapt to them the way you adapt to the lean in a floor. You compensate without thinking about it until the compensation is just how you walk. You stop noticing the silence because you fill it. You stop noticing the state of things because you've normalized the state of things. You stop noticing, after a while, what it felt like to have someone nearby. My wife Elsa had been dead 11 years. She died of something that started in her lungs and took its time about it, which is the worst kind of way to lose somebody. Not sudden, which is its own horror, but slow enough that you get used to the diminishment before the final diminishment. And then when it comes, you're not prepared anyway because some part of you never believed it would be the end. I won't say more about Elsa than that. She was a good woman who deserved more years than she got, and I was a man who didn't fully understand what I had until I'd had time to think about it without her, which is not the order a man would choose. After she died, I got on with it. I know how to get on with things. It's not a virtue particularly, it's just a disposition. You do the next right thing, you feed the animals, you fix the fence, you eat something, you sleep. And then you do it all again, and you don't look at it sideways because if you look at it sideways it seems like what it is, which is a life going forward through days without anybody who knows your name the way she knew it. What I'm saying is that by the time Nora Vass sat on my step that morning I had been a long while without certain things, and I'd gotten used to it, or I thought I had. Along toward the middle of December, Tully Meeks rode out. Tully is one of those men who has appointed himself the informational center of a 10-mile radius. He knows everything that's happening, and he's made it his business to make sure you know he knows it. He came out ostensibly to talk horses, because he runs a few head of his own and usually has a question or a proposition. But I knew when I saw him that the horses were secondary. He came in and I poured him coffee, and Nora was in the kitchen, and Tully's eyes went there, and stayed there for a moment in the way of a man cataloging something for later use. He said, "Heard you had somebody helping out at the place." I said, "That's right." He said, "Woman." I said, "That's right." He picked up his coffee and he said, in the particular way people say things they're pretending to say casually, "Folks in town have got a view on that." I looked at him. I said, "What view is that, Tully?" He shifted in the chair. He said, "Well, she's got a reputation, Harlan. I don't know the whole of it, but there's talk that she was let go from the Bleecker place for improper conduct." I said, "She was never at the Bleecker place." Tully said, "Well, there's something. I can't account for every detail." I said, "She came here looking for work. She does good work. That's the whole of it." Tully said, "I'm just telling you what people are saying." I said, "People say a lot of things that don't require anybody to go to the trouble of repeating them." Tully left his coffee half done, and not long after he left in a way that had some dignity salvaging in it, and I went back into the kitchen, and Nora was at the stove with her back to me, and she said, without turning around, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "I know." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "It'll make it worse for you, standing up for a woman nobody around here knows." I said, "I know what I'm doing, Nora." She turned around then and looked at me. A long look, the kind she gave you when she was deciding something. Then she turned back to the stove. I didn't make more of it than that. There wasn't any reason to. But I'll tell you something. I went out to the barn after and I fed the horses and I stood there for a while in the cold, and what I felt was not the indignation a man feels when he's done something righteous. It was something quieter, something that had to do with the fact that I'd meant it, every word of it, and meaning a thing after a long time of not having much to mean things about sits different in you than you expect it to. Christmas came and went the way it does when you're working. I put a chicken on and Nora made 2 pies, apple and something with dried cherries she'd brought in her bag, and we ate at the kitchen table on Christmas afternoon, with the light going early the way it does in December, lamp lit, and it was quiet in the house and not uncomfortable. She'd given me a small thing, a piece of work she'd done herself, a braid of horsehair in a pattern I recognized but couldn't name, worked into a small ring shape, the kind you hang on a hook for luck. She set it on the table beside my plate without making it into anything. I'd gotten her something in garnet the last time I'd gone in for supplies, which was a pair of gloves, proper winter ones, lined. She'd been wearing what she had, which was enough but not what I'd want someone to be wearing in the kind of cold we'd been having. I put them beside her plate. She picked them up and looked at them for a moment. She didn't get theatrical about it. She said, "These are good gloves." I said I had to guess the size. She said, "They'll fit." She put them on right there at the table. They did fit. We ate and talked a little, and there was a point in the afternoon when we were sitting with the second cup of coffee and the light outside had gone blue dark and the stove was ticking warm, that it struck me how strange it was that I had stopped noticing the silence. Not because it was gone, but because what had taken its place didn't feel like noise. It felt like someone was there. I hadn't known those were different things. January was hard, and February was worse. I lost a calf in January to the cold, one of my own, not a client's, which is a particular kind of loss, the kind that costs you not just money but something harder to name. You raise an animal from nothing, and when it goes, it's not a small thing. I didn't make a production of it. I buried what needed burying and went on, but Nora noticed. She didn't say anything about it, which was right. She just put extra on my plate that night and refilled the coffee without being asked. In February, I came down sick. I'm not a man who gets sick often, and I'm not a man who handles it well when I do. By which I mean, I don't slow down fast enough, and then I pay for it. I had some kind of fever that hit me on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon I was in the kind of state where the barn seemed further away than it was, and I was having a conversation with myself that I wasn't entirely following. Nora looked at me at noon and said, "Flat, you're going to bed." I said I had the afternoon feeding to do. She said, "I'll do it." I said she didn't know the rotation. She said, "Tell me the rotation." I told her the rotation. She wrote it on the back of a flour sack wrapper with a pencil stub and said, "Go to bed, Harlan." I went. I don't know how long I was down, 3 days, maybe 4. The worst of it was the second day, when the fever went high enough that I wasn't clear on where I was for a stretch, which is a disorienting experience and one I don't recommend. What I remember is coming up through it at intervals, the way you come up through water, and each time there was lamplight in the room, and at one of those intervals there was a hand on my forehead, cool and steady, and I heard her voice saying something low that I couldn't quite make out, and I went back down again, and it was the going back down that was easier for what I'd felt and heard. When I came all the way up, on what I think was the 4th morning, she was sitting in the chair beside the bed, not watching me anxiously, not hovering, just sitting, doing some mending by the lamp. When I moved, she looked over. She said, "How's your head?" I said it was better. She said, "You want coffee?" I said I did. She got up and went to get it, and when she came back she handed me the cup and I sat up, which was harder than I wanted it to be, and I said, "The horse is all right." She said, "The horses are fine. The chestnut mare's fetlock heat is down. I've been keeping it wrapped." I looked at her. She said, "The rotation's not complicated once you do it a couple of times." I said, "You did all of it." She said, "I did all of it." I sat there with the coffee in my hands that weren't quite steady yet, which I noticed and didn't mention, and I looked at the lamp on the table, and at the woman sitting in the chair she'd pulled up to my bedside, and I thought about the last time anyone had sat in that chair. It had been Elsa, when I'd gotten a bad cut off a piece of wire, and she'd sat there and cleaned it and wrapped it, and told me I was a fool for not wearing gloves, and that was probably 15 years ago, maybe more. There wasn't anything to say that was commensurate with what I was thinking. I said, "Thank you, Nora." She said, "Don't let it happen again. You pushed through 2 days too long before you stopped." I said, "You're probably right." She said, "I am right," and then she went back to the mending. I was up and around by the end of the week. I didn't admit to myself yet the thing I was in the process of understanding. Men my age can be slow about that, not from stupidity but from long practice at not naming things that might not be there. You've been wrong before. You've been hopeful before. And you've learned something from the outcome of hope that makes you careful with it. But in March, something happened that moved things along faster than I'd been managing them in my head. It was Bleecker. Albert Bleecker was a man of some standing in Garnett County. He ran the biggest spread. He sat on the county commission. He was a man whose opinion other men sought even when he hadn't offered it. He also had, as I said, buried 2 wives, and he'd reached the age of 68 still thinking that what he required was a woman who would come into his household and supply the management of it and be grateful for the position, which he didn't distinguish, or chose not to distinguish, from the other kind of position. He rode out to my place on a Thursday in March, in the afternoon, alone, which was unusual for Bleecker, who tended to bring company as a kind of punctuation. I was out at the fence line replacing a post, and I saw him come up the drive, and I came down and met him, and he dismounted. He had the kind of face that wealth gives a man who wasn't well favored to start, thick and sure of itself, the eyes sitting back like they were used to issuing verdicts. He said he'd come to talk about the woman. I said, Nora Vass works for me. He said, I'm aware of that. I'm here to make you an offer. I waited. He said Nora had come to him in November looking for a position, and he'd offered her more than she'd declined, and he felt he hadn't made himself clear about what the position included, and he was prepared to make the offer again on clearer terms, and he was asking me professionally, man to man, whether I would stand aside and let her make her own decision about it. He said it like he was doing me a favor, like he was acknowledging me enough to consult me, rather than simply going around me. I put the post driver down in the mud, and I straightened up and looked at him. I said, she made her decision in November, Albert. She made it again when she came here. She'll make it again if you ask her, and I expect the answer will be the same. He said, she's in no position to be particular. I said, she's in exactly the position she's in, which is a working woman who's made her choice about the work she wants to do. You don't get a say in that. He said, I'm asking you to step aside, Cade. I said, I heard you the first time. He looked at me for a long moment. He had a way of looking at men when he didn't get what he wanted, where the look said he was deciding what category to put you in for future reference. I'd seen him use it on other men, and it worked on them. He got back on his horse. He said, you're making an enemy over a cook. I said, that's my business. He rode out. I stood there in the mud of the fence line and let the quiet come back, and then I went back to setting the post. My jaw was tight and I made myself loosen it. There's a kind of anger that's clean that comes from knowing you're right and staying on that ground, and there's a kind you have to watch that wants to pull you off the thing you're standing for and make it about something else. I stayed with the clean one. I set the post. When I came in that evening, Nora had supper on. I sat down and she poured the coffee and sat down across from me, and she said, Bleecker was here. I said, I know. She said, I saw him from the window. I said, he came to talk about you. She looked at me steadily. I said, I told him you'd made your choice. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, he'll make trouble. I said, he might. She said, for you. I said, I'm aware. She sat with that. She looked at the table and then she looked back up at me. She said, Harlan, you don't have to do this. I said, Nora, I want you to hear me. You came to this place because there was nowhere else. You've done honest work here for 4 months. You've earned whatever standing that gives you. I'm not doing you a favor. I'm just stating what's true. She held the coffee cup in both hands and looked at it, and then looked at me. She said, I'm not used to somebody saying that. I said, I expect that's true of a lot of things that should have been said. She didn't look away. She kept looking at me, and something in her face changed, not dramatically, not with any theatrics. It was more like the stillness that had been in her face since she arrived shifted, just slightly, into a different kind of stillness. The kind that isn't braced anymore. We sat there across the kitchen table, and we didn't say anything else, and we didn't need to. Bleecker made the trouble he said he would. It came in the form of a rumor that was different from the earlier one, more specific, the kind that has just enough shape to it to stick in people's minds and get repeated. I won't go into the details because they were false, and giving them too much description makes them last longer. What I will say is that by April there was talk in Garnet about Nora Vass and about me, and the talk was the kind that women and men on either side of it find uncomfortable, for opposite reasons. 2 things happened that month that I'll tell you. The first is that I rode into Garnet for supplies on a Tuesday, and I ran into Pete Aldis, who runs the feed store and who is a man I have done business with for many years and consider roughly honest. Pete stopped me on the sidewalk and said, in a low voice and with the pained look of a man delivering news he doesn't enjoy delivering, that some folks in town were saying I should think about the arrangement out at my place and whether it was seemly. I looked at Pete for a moment. Pete is a good man, fundamentally, but he has a quality I've seen in a lot of good men, which is that they'll carry a message they're not sure they believe because somebody asked them to and they didn't know how to say no to being asked. I said, Pete, is that your view? He said, well, no, Harlan, I don't. I said, then I don't need to hear it. I went in and bought my supplies and rode home. On the way home, I let myself think about it in the way I'd been not letting myself think about it, which is to say, I let myself think clearly about what was actually happening and what it meant and what I was going to do about it. What was actually happening was that Albert Bleecker, who had been told no by a woman who had every right to tell him no, was using the machinery of county opinion to punish her for it, and me for supporting her. And what that machinery required to run was people who would pass the message and not quite believe it themselves and feel bad about it afterward. What it meant was that this was going to get worse before it got better. What I was going to do about it was keep doing what I was doing. The second thing that happened in April was that Nora told me she'd heard the talk. She said it at breakfast on a Saturday morning, setting the plate down in front of me, and then sitting down across from me with her own plate, and saying it the way she said most things straight, without leading up to it. She said, I've heard what they're saying in town. I said, I expect you have. She said, I won't have it costing you your standing here. I said, Nora. She said, I mean it, Harlan, I can find something. I can go north too. I said, stop. She stopped. I said, I want to say something, and I want you to hear it the whole way through before you say anything back. She waited. I said, I've been alone on this place for 11 years. I've managed it well enough. I'm not a man who needed rescuing, but I want you to understand what's been different since you've been here. Not just the house, not just the work, though that's real. I mean that there's been someone here who does what she says she'll do and says what she means and treats the work as worth doing and the animals as worth caring for and the man she works for as worth. I stopped. I looked at the table. Worth a straight answer, I said. I looked up. She was looking at me. I said, I'm not asking you to stay out of an obligation you didn't sign up for, and I'm not asking you to stay because I can't manage without you, because I can. I'm asking you because I'd like you to, because you've made this place feel like there's somebody in it, and because I'd rather face whatever Bleecker has in mind with you here than have a clean reputation and go back to what it was before. I hadn't planned to say all of that. Some of it surprised me while I was saying it. She sat very still, a long time, long enough that I thought I might have read it wrong, and I started to plan what to say to restore us to level ground if I had. Then she said, Harlan, you could have anybody. I said, that hasn't been my experience. She made a sound that was almost a laugh, a small one. She said, I'm not easy to get along with. I said, I haven't noticed that. She said, you haven't seen me when things don't go the way I think they should. I said, I've seen you in a 2-day snowstorm. I've seen you with a panicked horse. I've seen you keep my animals alive when I couldn't get out of bed. I think I have some idea of who you are. She looked at me a long time. She said, I'm not going anywhere, Harlan. She said it quiet, not big, like a fact she'd decided on. I said, all right. She said, all right. She picked up her coffee and I picked up mine, and we ate breakfast and talked about what needed doing that day, which was a normal amount of things. And the morning came in through the window the way it does in April when the hard part of winter is behind you and you can trust the light a little more. The trouble with Bleecker came to a head in May. He put it in front of the county commission. This is the thing about a man like Bleecker. He has instruments available to him that other men don't. He raised a question about the propriety of the arrangement at the Cade place and whether the county commission had any view to offer. This was a piece of maneuvering dressed up as civic concern, and most people in that room knew it. But there are things that get momentum once they start regardless of what people privately think about them. I heard about it from Pete Aldis, who had the decency to come and tell me in person, and who seemed to feel genuinely bad about the role he'd played earlier, which I credited him for. He said the commission was going to hear it on a Thursday. I said I'd be there. I was there. Nora came with me, which was her decision and not mine to make. She wore the good wool coat she'd arrived in, which she kept well, and her hair was done back and she looked like what she was, which was a woman who knew who she was and wasn't asking the room's permission for it. The commission was 5 men, 2 of whom I knew well and 1 of whom I'd done business with, and 2 of whom were Bleecker's men in everything but the technical sense. Bleecker sat to one side with a lawyer he'd brought up from county seat. They read out the matter. They dressed it in the language commissions use when they're not quite willing to say what they mean: concern for community standards, questions of propriety, the good order of the county. It was something to listen to. They asked if I had anything to say. I stood up. I said, Nora Vass has been working at my place since November. She came looking for work and I hired her because I needed someone and she was capable. She has done the job she was hired to do and done it well. She has kept the house, managed the stock when I was unable to, and conducted herself with more decency than I've seen out of a fair number of people in this room. Bleecker shifted in his chair. I said, I understand why this matter is before you and I understand who put it here. What I don't understand is how the conduct of a woman who goes looking for honest work and finds it is the business of a county commission. If any man in this room can explain that to me, I'd be grateful to hear it. No one said anything. I said, what I can tell you is this. Nora Vass is a woman of good character and honest work. I know this from living on the same property with her for 6 months and from having my eyes open. If there's a question about my judgment or my character, I'll hear it. But there's no question that needs answering about hers. I sat down. They deliberated, which in this case meant 5 men sitting at a table, finding a way to say that what they'd been asked to find was nothing to find. They dismissed the matter. Bleecker's lawyer said something procedural, and the chairman said the commission's decision was its decision, and that was that. We walked out into the May morning, and it was the first real warm day of the year, and the air had that quality that only comes in the week or two just after winter finally decides to be done with you clean. A little green in it, real. Nora walked beside me to the horses. She said, you didn't have to stand up in there the way you did. I said, I didn't say anything that wasn't true. She said, you know what I mean. I said, I meant every word of it. She looked at me in the morning light, the street of garnet behind her, her horse's lead rope in her hand. She looked at me the way she'd looked at me in the kitchen in April, that particular look of a woman who's decided something all the way through. She put her free hand against my chest, not a dramatic gesture. just put her hand there, flat, like she was making sure something was there and real. She said, "You're a good man, Harlan Cade." She said it quietly, looking at me, and I stood there and let it land. I don't know how to tell you what that did to me, and I'm not going to try very hard, because some things aren't improved by being described. What I'll say is that I had not heard anything like that in a very long time, not spoken the way she spoke it, plain, without embellishment, as a simple statement of what she saw. And a man who's been a long time without someone seeing him has a particular relationship to being seen. I put my hand over hers. I said, "So are you." She gave me a look that was almost the small laugh again. She said, "I have my days." I said, "I've seen your days." She took her hand away and turned to her horse, and I turned to mine, and we rode home in the warm of the first real May morning. We were married in July. Not a big thing. Pete Alda stood up for me, and a woman named Clara Breves, who was a friend of Nora's from years back in Kansas, made the trip up for it. The preacher in Garnet was a young man who took his work seriously and kept the ceremony to what it needed to be without dressing it up in more than would fit. Nora wore a dress the color of good saddle leather. She had her hair done different down a little, and she looked, I'll just say she looked right, like the version of herself she hadn't gotten the weather for in a long while. I wore the coat I'd had since before Elsa died, the charcoal wool, and when I put it on that morning it still fit, and that was something. We stood in front of the preacher and said the words. Nora looked at me the whole time, steady, the same way she'd looked at me that first morning from the bottom step, that same quality of not flinching from what she was looking at. When it was done, she said, quietly just to me, "No regrets." I said, "No regrets." She said, "Good." And she turned and we went back out into the July heat, and there was a meal at Pete's place that evening and some music, and the whole thing had a quality to it I hadn't been expecting, which was ease. Not the high feeling of a thing you've been waiting for, just ease. Like something that had been held at an angle was sitting flat. I want to tell you about something that happened in October, 3 months after the wedding. I was out east of the place, patching fence, and Nora came out to me in the afternoon on the Blue Roan, which was the mare we'd been working together that summer and that she'd taken too. She came up and dismounted and tied the horse to the post I was working at and stood there. She said, "I've been thinking about something." I set down the tool I was using and looked at her. She said, "I want to put more time on the horses. I think there's a market for what you're doing with the 3-year-olds, and I think if we run 2 or 3 more through the winter we could sell well in the spring. I've been looking at it, and I think the numbers work." I said, "Let me see what you've been looking at." She had it on a piece of paper in her coat pocket, a column of figures in her precise handwriting, the cost of feed and the going rates and what she thought we could get. It was careful work. It was right. I said, "You're right on the numbers." She said, "I usually am." I said, "Let's do it." She folded the paper and put it back in her pocket. She looked out over the east pasture, the October grass, the sky going that particular autumn color. She said, "This is a good piece of land." I said, "It leans to the southwest." She said, "I know. You can fix the table with a shim." I said, "I've been doing that for years." She said, "I know that too." She picked up the end of the fencing wire and held it while I worked, and we didn't say anything else for a while, and the afternoon went long and quiet around us, and the horses moved in the east pasture, and that was how it was. I've been trying to think of how to tell you what this year has been. It has not been without difficulty. Bleaker is still bleaker, and there are people in Garnet who carry their opinions about us into the general air of the place, and I don't imagine that's going to change. The work is the work, hard in winter, relentless in the dry stretches, the kind of thing that doesn't leave room for self-pity because it keeps moving. But there is somebody who knows my name the way somebody knows your name when they've been watching you do what you do and they see it, the real version of it, without the window dressing you put on for company, who hands you the right tool before you ask for it because she's seen the way you work, who is up before you in the morning not because you asked her to be, but because she is, who sat beside your bed and put a cool hand on your forehead when the fever was high, and said something low in the dark that you couldn't quite hear and didn't need to hear to know what it was. There is a woman who chose this place because there was nowhere else to go, and then chose to stay when she could have gone. That is not the same thing, and I know the difference, and I am grateful for the difference every morning when I come out of the bedroom, and the fire is already going, and the coffee is on, and someone is there who sees the man I actually am, whatever that is, and decides it's enough. The steps are still cold in November. The door latch still needs hitting twice. The kitchen table still leans. I've got a shim under it now. She put it there,